About to get started. I'm Chris Mons. I'm in Department of Environment and Society, and I'm very happy to have Chris Armatas with us today. What's really interesting for me today is have quite a history together, but we never met until about an hour ago. And some of that background Chris will share with you today. Some of our shared history has to do with his academic background. He did his bachelor's at St. Lawrence University back in New York State at a time that I was there as a faculty member, but we never crossed paths. He's been at the University of Montana more or less since then, did his master's degree and his PhD in forestry and conservation sciences. And since completing his PhD in 2019, he's been at the Aldo Leopold Institute, and I've had a long history of collaborating with folks there too. So I'm very glad to have Chris here and hearing about his current work. Today, his talk is going to be focused on social ecological challenges and the role of conservation social sciences applying a pragmatist lens. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Chris. We're both named Chris, too. All right. Can you all hear me okay? Is that good? Yeah, thanks. I guess first off, thanks for having me. I'm really humbled by this request and honored to be here. It's always humbling to get an invite to speak to people about your work. So thanks for that. Thanks to Irie and Noah really for spearheading the hosting duties. It's really been a great time so far. So there's two talks. Today is, about 40 minutes of a general talk, I was told, and that's where we're going to go here. And then tomorrow we'll get kind of more into the deep dive of a couple projects. But I have kind of three goals today. The first is to highlight really Forest Service research. When I started as a graduate student, I had no idea that the federal agencies had kind of a significant research kind of arm and effort within the context of conservation sciences. So I'll speak a bit to that. That won't take too long. I'll talk about where the Leopold Institute fits within that as well. And then the second goal is to highlight some of my work, some of my research. I really didn't want to roll through a bunch of projects in kind of a listing, self-aggrandizing way, but I will talk about 5 research projects really briefly and kind of in a cursory way. We don't have time, of course, in this amount of time to really fully get into those. But happy to take any comments, and I have my email at the end. If you have any questions on any of this stuff, feel free always to follow up. Happy to hear from people. But kind of the third goal, and really is the main hope, is to kind of tie those projects together with a common thread. And that's where this pragmatist lens comes in. We're going to get a little bit philosophical. I won't go too into the weeds, hopefully, on that. But as we think about our science and research activities, sometimes you ask those deeper questions like, well, what's this for? Or what are my kind of assumptions as I go about doing this work? So I'll try to tie all that together. It is a new talk. Humbled by this invite, I tried to come up with something fresh. So it's a bit like a band playing a new song. So hopefully it goes okay. But yeah, so we'll go there. And before I go, the last thing I'll say on this is that I suppose I could have said, change this title a bit to Social-ecological challenges and a role of the conservation social sciences. So this is my perspective in some ways. There's a lot of different ways you can approach, social sciences or just conservation sciences in general. And then this is just one of them. So not to crowd out all the other ideas out there. I think this idea can kind of work in concert with those as well. So just a quick outline. I'll talk about myself a little bit and the Leopold Institute and Forest Service research, and then really jump into the talk, which will be just listed here. Motivations, I'll talk about what I mean by social ecological challenges, overview this pragmatist lens idea, explore 5 research projects, like I said, pretty briefly, talk about contributions, implications, and then end with some limitations, keep ourselves grounded. So, I'm a person and dad, and before I'm a researcher. So here's my daughter, Maeve and Beckler, and my wife, Stephanie. I've been a research scientist at the Leopold Institute since March of 2020. And I see myself as kind of having this interdisciplinary socio-ecological systems lens, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And I'm a conservation social scientist, I guess. That feels so broad, it's almost meaningless in a way, but I'll kind of talk about what I mean there. I don't know that I have like a real specific disciplinary home. But really quickly, so what is the Leopold Institute? As Chris mentioned, I work for the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. I don't know how many people know the Forest Service, but the Forest Service is there. You know, you can kind of think of maybe three main arms, branches, units, goals. The agency would probably have a better way of saying that than that, but there's state and private and tribal forestry. There's the National Forest System, so the grasslands and the forests, like the Uinta National Forest, for instance. Those folks you see out there, rangers, supervisor, those types of folks, right? And then there's research and development. So there's a whole branch of research and development, and there's research stations. And I work for the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And within that station, there's these 9 program areas. So just I know that there's diverse interests out here. Maybe wilderness as an idea isn't your cup of tea or all that interesting, but you can kind of see we have fuel, fire, and smoke, wildlife ecology, water and watershed. So a lot of different type of areas and program areas that just the Rocky Mountain Research Station is focusing on. And then within that is the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. And we're the only we're the only program focused on wilderness at the national level, and really even the international level. And we are kind of unique in this setting because we're interagency. So since wilderness is interagency, designated wilderness goes across Park Service land, BLM land, Forest Service land, Fish and Wildlife Service land. We work a lot with those. So I do projects with the Park Service and the BLM and so on, and of course with the Forest Service as well. So just to give you there's research scientists in all of these kind of positions. Okay, so what's the motivation for this work? You know, really, it's kind of a few things. One is kind of this ongoing existential doubt. You know, as I was doing research early in my graduate career and even after that, you know, I was doing these studies, some of which I'll talk about tomorrow, several of which I'll deep dive in or talk about today, and then a bunch I deep dive into tomorrow as well, where I was like, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. I'm doing this work, I'm doing this research, I'm learning about people and their connections to forests or rivers, but what's the application was really my question. You know, what am I contributing this to? So I was really kind of unsure if it was doing anything. And then related to that, I would write papers like many of us do here. And I'd publish those papers, and I always write, this really informs management. And I couldn't really convince myself of that. I wrote it in the paper because it's important you do that. But you wonder, does it really? It felt a bit like a platitude, I'll be honest. So I was kind of curious, well, okay, I don't feel great about that statement. And then this elusive elevator speech and hybrid disciplines. And what I mean by that is I'm not an economist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist. I don't have strict backgrounds in any of those places. I read a lot early on in my graduate career about ecological economics, conservation biology, human ecology, political ecology. These are all kind of, I call them some people call them research traditions. They wouldn't even say they're disciplines, right? But it's kind of this broad kind of mixture, interdisciplinary. It's great, it's transdisciplinary, but it's hard to say who you are and what you are and kind of what your beliefs are. So this elevator speech was a bit elusive. And then lastly, I wanted to find a balance for you all today. I didn't want to go too deep into the philosophical stuff. These 3 things is the reasons why I really dove into, well, what is this work? Let me probe those underpinning assumptions, if you will. But I wanted to also kind of bring in some real life research and keep it grounded so we didn't get too up in the air and confuse everybody, including myself. So that's why I landed today on this kind of mix of kind of philosophy and actual projects. So what do I mean by when broadly defining socio-ecological challenges? You know, a lot of the work we do in these spaces, or at least I was doing in the College of Forestry and Conservation at University of Montana, College of Natural Resources, they're really not, you know, in some ways they're normative. Conservation sciences, it's like, well, you're doing science for some application. And I think socio-ecological challenges is really the backdrop to a lot of this work, right? These are wicked problems, we might say, in the literature, which is really another way of saying, well, there's no perfect answer. There's no single correct answer. It's not like aerodynamics or developing a plane wing. There's a lot of different values at stake. People might have different opinions about what the solution should be. They have different opinions about what the problem is. Knowledge is limited. The future is uncertain. Those are a few ways, right? So there's really challenging. There's a lot of different things coming in. There's these interacting systems. There's social systems. There's ecological systems. They're interacting with each other in interesting ways. Broad spatial scales that resonate. If you're thinking about a national forest, you might take action in the context of that forest, but it might resonate out to that broader spatial scale. So that makes things tricky. Goes forward in time. You're dealing with previous histories in those contexts. Numerous administrative boundaries. We have forests, we have state land, we have private land. There's feedback loops. You do something else might happen, and that causes another thing. And it's a lot to keep track of. There's a lot going on. And so we're working in these challenges, and we're trying our best as individual researchers, maybe research teams, to contribute something to that, right? But context really matters, I guess, is the takeaway from this. And so we're working within these problems, and then the question becomes, well, okay, so what is this one study I'm going to go do over here, this study over here? How's that going to contribute to that problem, or kind of what's that achieving? So we could talk all day about this idea, but those are just some kind of nuts and bolts and basic foundation for it. And so as I got into, like I said, my part of my dissertation, I really spent my entire dissertation thinking about this and how it related to my work. But I'm not going to, like I said, not going to totally get in the weeds onto this. We can talk about nature or reality, how we know what we know. There's a lot of these fancy words like epistemology and ontology. I'm not really fully going to get into that. What I really want to focus in on is just a few parts of it. And the main one is, really what are the goals of that research? So we might think of that in two ways. You can think of like the terminal goal, and sometimes that's thought of as like, at least in the literature, like, is it for prediction? Are you trying to predict something? Are you trying to explain some phenomena? Are you trying to understand it? Are you trying to describe it, right? And then the follow-up is maybe you do that, and then what's the instrumental goal? Are you trying to persuade people? Are you trying to, communicate better with people, apply it in some way, advance theory, kind of what's the point of that work? And so where I landed through some literature review is kind of, I liked this pragmatist approach, not to be confused with like the expedient, let's just get it done and move on, but more of a well thought out philosophy. It's got a lot of history. And really the main goal in that philosophy is communication and social learning. That's the ultimate thing you're striving for. So generally, as I start to layer in the conservation sciences, because in theory you can do pragmatist research. You could be a pragmatist legal scholar or a pragmatist biologist, or just like you can bring in most any foundational paradigm, if you will, into any, research tradition. So as a pragmatist kind of conservation social scientist, I thought, well, hooking up with these social processes and communication and social learning is really an important part of it. And that focus broadly for me is kind of human nature relationships. So really understanding how can we understand, at least in some limited way, those human nature relationships and how they interact within these broad contexts. So how people relate to, interact with, benefit from generally protected areas, like national forests, wilderness areas, wild and scenic rivers, and I'll talk about some of that in a minute. And you really need lots of different methods to kind of understand that. That's the other kind of basic assumption, is that no single method is going to get you that full understanding. So you got to go out and you got to try different things. And then you got to understand all these different perspectives that people have and these different relationships that people have. And then hopefully when you go to that application, you hook up somehow with these social processes. And I'll talk a bit about that. And then kind of a parallel goal is together as a group, as a community, at the community level, at the local level, we can kind of talk about what spatial scale is appropriate, but you're defining together sustainability. And we talked earlier about sustainability not really being a great term, because what does it mean? It's almost meaningless in some way. And lucky for Irie, normative sustainability is also empty. Like there really is no meaning here. It's normative by you work with those communities, you work in those areas, and you try to define what that is. What does the living sustainability in that context mean? And that has to happen almost every time, which is why hooking up with that social process is so important. And through understanding these different human nature relationships, maybe as a group you can come up, or you can at least debate, hopefully in a healthy way, what we're trying to sustain. What opportunities are we trying to sustain as we continue to interact with nature? And so all kind of, I know, kind of heady and 40,000 feet, but that's where I want to go as we keep this in mind moving forward. So what's my basic approach for kind of exploring these 5 research projects? I'm just going to set the context. So what is that social ecological challenge? I'm going to talk about the slice of knowledge provided by one study. And this gets back to this, we really only have this partial understanding with, even within the social realm, you only get a partial understanding. This is where you start to expose all you don't know. And that's where hopefully it can facilitate some interdisciplinary work, team up with other people who have knowledge about habitat connectivity or water quality or policy and how that interacts with people's human nature relationships and what that, you know, kind of impedes or facilitates receiving those or realizing those relationships. And then the current application, so like what this study in my eyes has kind of done so far, and maybe theoretical contribution of where it could go. And again, those the application and the contribution are through, again, just one idea. So I don't want people going out here saying like, this is the way all science is. This is just kind of my approach to how I view some of my own work. Okay. And we're going to work kind of by spatial scale. So starting at kind of, I guess, the smallest spatial scale, at least in terms of what management or practitioners or decision makers focus on. And then we'll move up to kind of really broad scales as well. So wild and scenic river planning. This is one example. This happens as per the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act here in the United States. Rivers are protected for their outstandingly remarkable values, which is an interesting way to phrase it, but that's the way they went. They need to preserve and protect these ORVs. They also need to do things like user capacity determination, which we were talking about over lunch, which is this idea where you have to pick a number. Essentially, you have to say this is the amounts and types of uses that sustain and protect these outstandingly remarkable values, right? So it can really quickly become an unwieldy problem, which is, you know, and you're doing this within communities. So in this example, I'm going to talk about Flathead, Montana, which actually isn't a place, but the Flathead Valley, Holston, Montana Glacier National Park, the Flathead Wild and Scenic River, beautiful river system that runs next to Glacier National Park through the Flathead National Forest. And when these rivers are designated, they're labeled with these outstandingly remarkable values. And that's what this thing over here is, but you can't probably see that well. But these are these different stretches of the river, and then an X after all the values that the river has. So pretty much all of these sections of the Flathead system have pretty much every value. And so they have to protect and preserve fisheries, geology, water quality, wildlife, botany, recreation, scenery, history, and ethnographic values, historic values, ethnographic values, which again is like, oh, well, that's a lot of stuff. And you got to protect and enhance those things or preserve those things. And that should say enhance, protect and enhance, excuse me. And so it gets really complex really quick, right? Particularly when you bring in the recreation element and the scenery element and some of these, you know, more social kind of squishy ideas of like, well, what kind of recreation experience? How do those things interact with these other values and wildlife, and which ones should we pick if we think the use is kind of maybe having some influence on the wildlife, how much influence is okay? So really quickly it gets messy. And the context is really messy. So what we did was, in the context of public engagement, again, this partial understanding, I was involved in some of the public engagement campaign that they had. And tomorrow we'll talk a lot about public engagement, but we went to public meetings, talked with about 160 people, also out into the field, and asked them, what's important to you? I had them play this kind of game that I'll get into tomorrow, but really they prioritize their values. These are the values that are important to me. These are the meanings and services that are important to me. And that could have been anything from, wildlife preservation to spontaneous experiences to quiet soundscapes, to the ability to kind of go whenever you want, all the way to understanding the history of the homesteaders, to indigenous use of the area. Right? There's all these things. And we had people kind of rank them, talk about what's important to them. And in the end, we got six divergent shared perspectives. So you find, well, that's a lot to accommodate. We're not be able to accommodate all of those. But in the context of the pragmatist lens, I think the goal is not to say this is the number one perspective or human nature relationship that we should be facilitating, but let's as a group understand one another, gather our perspectives in some social process, and really start to understand, well, that perspective's not really me. I'm more kind of in this perspective here. But I'm starting to understand, there was an unconfined recreation perspective. There was an indigenous worldview perspective. There was an outfitter and guide perspective, for instance. Those were 3 of the 6. And so you might really align with one of those, but the hope is that you can facilitate an understanding of all the others through some of this work. Not to really say, yeah, that's the choice, but almost to convince people that that choice is so hard, I don't know what I would do. But now I understand wherever the managers land, at least they were thorough in their thinking about it. So what did we do? I think there was some public recognition of the challenge. This one I was really excited. I did some follow-up interviews with people. I showed them the different perspectives, and they'd say, and they talked about them. Well, tell me a little bit more about those. And we did some qualitative discussion. And then it was like, well, what would you do? At the end, we ended the interview with, do you have any ideas? What would you do? And a lot of people said, ooh, I don't know. That's really hard. Like, this one's me, but that's really challenging. So that's kind of what I mean, hooking into that process. And that was only 19 people. So how do we do that at a broader scale? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. But, there was this recognition of the challenge. There was this recognition of these different people. And they said, yeah, that helps for me to see all these different perspectives, even though this one here is mine or that one over there is mine. I think it could go, I harp on communication, learning. It's kind of a public relations exercise. But when, some people say, well, what about making decisions? How did that help managers actually decide what they were going to do? I think there are some potential applications. I should say the Flathead is in the midst of this planning still. They haven't landed anywhere. They had to take a big break. And so sometimes these processes get bogged down. So we'll see. They might still be able to use some of this information to help develop their alternatives so they can at least make sure it touches on maybe one or most of those different perspectives. And then, yeah, a renewed public kind of engagement campaign. And that's kind of an implication that they still have to get back into this. So we'll see where it goes. All right. Now we're going a little bit broader, wilderness stewardship planning and visitor use management. So I guess it's maybe broader, maybe not, about the same spatial scale, but a wilderness area, Everglades National Park is mostly wilderness, 95%, which is pretty large. In their context, there is wilderness. This is within these boundaries. Wilderness character preservation, which I don't have time to overview, but there's a whole, almost like outstandingly remarkable values. They need to, protect naturalness, protect ecosystems from, too much human intervention, provide for outstanding opportunities for solitude, unconfined and a primitive type of recreation, historic, scientific, kind of a bunch of all these other qualities, undeveloped, needs to be largely undeveloped. They're also facing struggles with South Florida is the context, and it's massively diverse, but the folks using the wilderness area is not all that diverse. So, they recognize, well, we have this amazing resource and gem, but really not many, we don't have a diverse body of users. So that's another challenge in this context. And so, what can we do to help them as managers think through some of that and maybe work with the public or work with, various stakeholders and rights holders in a way that kind of addresses some of these challenges as they go forth in their planning process, their wilderness stewardship planning process. Working on a paper that should come out soon with these great authors. And it's really about what we did is, we did a visitor use survey with visitors. We're still kind of summarizing and analyzing that. But we also kind of spoke with underserved communities, representatives of underserved communities, and kind of asked them, what do you think of the wilderness concept, right? So we kind of got this idea about wilderness management, and then we brought in some ideas around, well, what about the wilderness concept? And if, again, I don't have time to dive into any of these details in this general talk, but if you are interested in any of this stuff, reach out. And we heard some really interesting things about how people relate to wilderness and wild spaces, and the park in particular, in Everglades National Park. And that's really just a piece of it. And whether they view it as a place that reminds them of, kind of this colonial legacy, or they view it as a place where they can escape and completely restore their mental health. I mean, we really heard the whole gamut. So there's a lot of opportunities there. But again, just a little piece of it. You need to work with policymakers. You need to work with, people who understand what are the kind of, where's the wiggle room in that decision making. The Everglades is facing all sorts of ecological issues that they need to focus on as well. When you think about wildness and the idea of like trying not to intervene, they have issues with pythons and invasive species is one big issue they have. So again, another real challenging context. And we just know a little bit of it with this. And, the realized and theoretical application is a little merged here because we're kind of in the midst of this. But the hope is we are really plugging in with managers in their wilderness stewardship planning process. So when I talk about linking up with social processes, I often think about like public engagement as one part, but also linking up with folks is another, with the managers actually doing this work. And so I'll keep moving. Next, National Forest Plan revision. So it gets a little bit broader. I've done a lot of work in this space. Broadly, National Forest System Plan revision, National Forest Plan revision is about sustaining, as per the 2012 planning rule, ecological, social, cultural, and economic sustainability. Not a small task. There's a lot of ins and outs in that, of course. And in this case, it was in Northwest Wyoming, in the Shoshone National Forest. So there's context there. There's, distrust of the federal government in some ways. There's challenges working with the public. And so how do you go about deciding how to sustain and, pursue ecological, social, cultural, and economic sustainability? And what we did was we did some of that public. Well, this one wasn't so much public engagement, but understanding these diverse perspectives with a couple valuation methods. So essentially, what values are important to you, what things are important to you, what benefits are important to you, what's influencing that. So bringing in this idea of, how does climate, for instance, influence what's important to you? And then also bringing in here we did some economic analysis, some stated preference analysis of the values, trying to put some monetary values on these, on a few select kind of top priority benefits of these diverse publics. So that gives you a couple different things, right? You get kind of a numeric quantitative estimate of what that value is, as limited as those can be. They can be really challenging. We could talk about those limitations. But you also have more of a qualitative understanding about how people relate to this space. So again, no real answers in here. What we ended up with is 4 perspectives, all of which are totally legitimate and fine perspectives in good human nature relationships. And they conflict in some ways. There's some synergies, there's some overlap. And maybe, in terms of decision making, maybe managers can kind of use that in a way to, there's agreement around water quality, maybe they focus there. But generally, I think, again, it's back to kind of talking with the public and highlighting and linking into those social processes to highlight what's so challenging about this work. And, This is a case where I did this research while they were doing their plan. I didn't finish this research until they finished their plan, until after they finished their plan, right? So that happens sometimes. And if I'm brass tacks, it was a contribution to the literature, and that's good. That's okay. Um, but he didn't get in there in time. So it highlights the challenge of not only, as we get these partial understandings, there's also the transdisciplinary research. So trying to link up with planners and managers and people outside those researcher roles. And the timing of that is so important. And, if you're kind of there a little late or you're doing something on the side and you're not really linked up with them, you might end up kind of getting this stuff out when it's too little too late in some ways. But that's okay. I learned from that experience. And the next time I didn't really engage with a planning team until they were further along. I can talk about that tomorrow. Now this gets real big. Environmental restoration in China. This is another project I recently worked on. And, this is a really interesting and kind of fascinating study. And the context is, oh, that should have said top-down governance. Sorry, I went through this so many times, but somehow I missed that. But ecological civilization, which is this initiative in China, high-level initiative from the national government, pursuing really ecological restoration is the idea. And it's a very top-down structure there. I don't think that's unsurprising. And the goal is really to, again, restore these ecosystems. And then this lake around in Yunnan, China, Erhai Lake it's called, they're having real issues with tourism growth. So not unlike here, some of that. Tourist growth explosion. Like we're talking millions of people over 10 years maybe coming from a rural area to a beautiful like scenic area within 10, 15 years, millions of people showing up. And the water quality was suffering. In some ways, they thought a lot of that was from tourism. And so what they did is they shut down almost 2,000 establishments, just shuttered them. So the inns, the hotels, the restaurants, there was this perception that they were really contributing to this pollution. And I think, rightly so it was in some ways. And so they just shut them down to restore this water quality to this lake. And so the project was understanding stakeholder perceptions of environmental justice. So, they reacted and put this policy in place. And our paper was kind of like, well, what are the perceptions of stakeholders? And so I kind of consulted on the methods here. I certainly didn't go around talking to folks in these communities, but the graduate students did, and they talked to folks, did interviews. They used Q methodology, which I'll talk about tomorrow, but there's really a lot of views on restoration outcomes and then the process. Did you have enough information? I mean, they didn't know, are we going to be able to reopen our inn, or, when can we reopen our inn? Those types of things. So there was questions about the process of this decision and then the outcomes of, some of those closures and what people were concerned about. And we found 4 different perspectives, and people were generally pretty behind, working together to restore the ecosystems, but thought it was gone about maybe a little bit like too quickly and maybe without, the input or thought of some of these different perspectives, some of the locals. There was stigma for some of that, agricultural folks because they were given some of the blame. So it was a really interesting dynamic. But again, when you start to learn about these different perspectives of social justice or environmental justice in this case, where do we go with that? And, I think it's a nice contribution to the literature. There wasn't really, I don't know what social processes you'd even plug into, but what we talk about in the discussion of this paper is a bit about kind of, well, what does good governance look like? Thinking about injecting some of that democratic process. There were certainly some perspectives that thought it would have been nice, but others that were okay with it, right? So to be clear, there was not full consensus on what people would like to see in terms of how these environmental restoration projects are pursued. And then maybe some public engagement with some of the other ideas. Okay, last one, and then I'll get on to the discussion. We'll leave 15 minutes. I don't know if this is more, I guess given the size of China, maybe this is a smaller spatial scale. But amenity migration and development. So some other recent research I've been working on is kind of looking at really what is the formula, which I'll talk about in a minute, that is leading, and what are kind of the interactions between amenity migration, so people moving to an area for lifestyle, for beautiful natural resources. People living here can probably understand that. I'm sure this is part of that. Missoula, Montana, where I come from, is part of that. So people moving into rural areas for nature and lifestyle. Changing communities certainly changes the dynamic in these communities. It happens mostly on private land, so that's kind of a challenging context, right? Like, this amenity, it's not like there's the public lands that are actually, we'll talk about in a minute, drawing folks, but the development and the raising housing prices, and those types of things is happening, mostly on private lands. And the context that we talked about in this paper is mostly the Western United States. And what we looked at was a development index. So looking at a combination of housing prices over $200,000, percentage of seasonal homes and secondary homes, and in-migration in the last 5 years, although I think it was from 2015 to the 5-year migration rate. And that's kind of the index. So that's kind of in these methods, the dependent variable. So what was leading to that development? So as that development index went up, what were the independent variables that we found that were significant? Unsurprisingly, and this is why I just say the formula for the phenomena, that's what we understood in some ways, given it's kind of a regression model that Evan would be able to talk about better than I. But protected areas were a big part of that, right? People are coming to these areas for beautiful vistas and access to recreation, but wilderness in particular. So wilderness lands, designated wilderness in particular, had a strong association. Other things would probably be unsurprising. Cool summers was part of that. Rural settings. These were rural counties. I should be clear. This development was in rural counties in the West, not including Alaska, just in the Western United States. And particularly rural areas with like airport access. So some of these things you say, of course, yeah, people want, be able to get there, particularly if they're going to their second home. They want to be able to get out into these beautiful places. Cool summers are nice. And so we're kind of seeing this relationship. And that's kind of what the paper teases apart. But what is kind of this application? Again, another contribution to the literature, and that's great. But for some people, when it comes to planning for these areas, we had some suggestions that there might be, county commissioners might see that as a real nice thing, right? It's bringing money into the tax base, the coffers. But there's other folks in the community who might not like that dynamic as much. You have the people moving in. So how are these different relationships in the context of amenity migration and development changing, and what are they? Something that I would like to get into a bit more. And how you link up with a social process, I'm not really sure. These are kind of theoretical applications. Again, facilitate preemptive planning discussions is kind of, one of the things we've thought about. If you could get ahead of this, and a lot of these communities, trains kind of left the station, but maybe there's abilities to preemptively plan in areas that haven't felt it so much. And then back to this normative sustainability discussion is facilitate some of those. What kind of community do people want to live in within the context of these changing dynamics? And that's a role for the kind of conservation social sciences. But again, you got to bring in all sorts of other folks and their expertise as well. Okay, so summarizing the role of social science in my view. This was from my thesis. I use this picture all the time just to highlight the complexity of systems and context, and the challenge on the last slide of amenity migration, for instance. The irony is sometimes these are happening in these communities that don't really like to be told how to use their public or private land, I should say. And there's a lot of issues with short-term rentals, those types of things. This was on the side of a bentonite plant in Wyoming, which I was talking to folks like this around water-based benefits and forest planning. But I love that picture because I think it does kind of highlight we're not making any of these decisions or doing any of these wicked problem solving in vacuums. Um, so just summarizing the role, facilitating communication and social learning, like that's the goal of where I see some of this work going for. It's certainly been, more or less successful in hooking up with these social processes to do that. And then kind of the second point is like consensus and understanding. To me, that's the goal, I guess. We always talk about, I've been working in some collaborative work around wilderness management in Alpine Lakes Wilderness outside of Seattle. And the collaborative's talking a lot about consensus. What are we going to come to consensus about? And I don't know that consensus and outcomes, like, yeah, we want to do this in this wilderness area. We want to maybe restrict use and maybe slow down the number of people coming in. I don't know that you're going to get everyone on board there. But I think there can be this consensus and understanding where people at least walk away from a process and say, well, that's not really how I wanted to go, to be honest, in terms of the outcomes, but I understand why they did that. I get all of these ins and outs and the complexity of this system, at least to a point where I was totally taken aback by the challenge of the task. So it's kind of like convincing people how hard this job is and how hard it is to make a decision or implement something that really helps everybody in some of these situations. And you get through that, I think, through these diverse human nature relationships and understanding of these complex systems, and that, again, there's really no perfect answers. And what are the implications of that for a pragmatist researcher? You really got to link up with the social process. And I've done that better or worse in different situations. And I don't know how you do that sometimes. It's really hard. Meaning getting out into collaborative settings, getting into public engagement, getting integrated into management, actual planning processes in some way. It deprivileges single knowledge source. When you think about the complexity of any one of those contexts, the social science piece, of which you could have 10 social science pieces, is like just one part of it. Then you got to bring in all these other parts. So hopefully it leads to some level of humility. Like, I don't have the answer. I can help with this little bit. And then we need, a whole other group of folks to get to the rest. And then we'll still probably never be there because that full knowledge is real challenging. Excuse me. Blurred lines between the researcher, practitioners, and the interested publics. I've been experiencing this more and more where, when I'm engaging with managers and trying to come up with a process and help them maybe learn from the public and, okay, when are you going to do public meetings? Can I be a part of that? Here's the questions we're thinking about asking. How's that look to you? Do you have any ideas? Then they're engaged in the actual research process. And I'm engaged in kind of the management, not decision-making, but kind of in that process of public engagement. And you start to see this blurring of lines. And sometimes I'm feeling like, well, I don't know that that's in a vacuum the choice I'd make from a social science perspective, but we're kind of working together on this. So there becomes kind of a little bit of a give and take. I find you have to almost not be so adamant about sticking to maybe theoretical ideas or boundaries within scientific practice. Science becomes a little more blurry and collaborative. I guess transdisciplinary is ultimately the goal. And for me anyway. And then it kind of says something about the theory application ratio. So not that these are mutually exclusive. I'm not saying some piece of science is going to only contribute to theory or only contribute to application. Obviously, they feed each other in, good theoretical contributions and publishing in high-ranking journals and, gives people confidence in science and people's ability to do science. So that's important. But it does end up pushing, as someone who works for an agency, towards more kind of applied methods and applied science. And so I think it tilts the application a bit there. And then, all right, almost right on time. So I'll end here. The limitations I see are a couple. For the research, I find myself kind of doing and evaluating. So when I talk about, well, what's the influence on social learning and communication and people understanding one another? One, you're in there trying to learn from them about their relationships to the forest or to the river or whatever. And I feel like there's a couple good methods, one of which I'll talk about tomorrow, that deep dive, that was pretty successful. But then you kind of have to evaluate, well, what's the impact of that work within that social process? It almost becomes like two jobs. It's like you need someone to help do the research and help them with the structured understanding and knowledge gathering, if you will. And then you also need someone else who's going to engage in the evaluation and say, ooh, that method really worked. They really understood one another. It facilitated good, productive conversation. That method over there, not so much. So you kind of have to do both when you start to talk about it hooking up with and helping to co-design social processes. And then for the potential impact or just the ability to do the work, because it's expensive to kind of co-produce research. It just takes a long time. It takes a lot of effort. And then it's not lost on me that I'm talking about social processes and good debates and understanding one another and learning about one another and accepting differences in a climate that sometimes feels increasingly hard to do that. So maybe that's the Achilles heel and there's nowhere to go. But despite that, I'll kind of keep an open mind and hope we can move forward and make some progress. So hopefully that was coherent in some way and made some sense. But yeah, happy to have any questions or thoughts.
Questions?
Can you hear me? Yes. Oh, great. Well, it was great to hear more about your background, and I'm surprised that our paths haven't crossed. Maybe they have, like you and Chris Moss